Welcome. My name is Nicole de Haas and I am the president of the Foundation for Spiritualism and Mediumship Holland. The foundation is officially established on October 16th, 2017. The aim of the foundation is to collect, to manage and to share knowledge about mediumship and spiritualism, national and international. The foundation strives to reach this by collecting documentation, books, items, objects, to create a wonderful collection about national and international mediumship. Also by conserving the history of pioneers in the field of mediumship, by maintaining a museum and library that is accessible for everyone, and sharing knowledge and experience, of course. The plans for the museum and library already exists for a few years. I find it very important that there will be a place created for people where they can get information about mediumship, the history in Holland, Europe and worldwide. We have a wonderful history and many pioneers have paved the way for us so that we can live and practice mediumship in freedom nowadays. They deserve to be remembered. It shows us that mediumship of the past knows a great history with a quality of mediumship that we rarely see today. We have been able to find 2 locations where the museum and library will be established. Also an online library will be part of our plan and project, but we cannot do this alone. We organized several charity events over the past years to raise money to be able to obtain rare and precious objects. Unfortunately, most of them are still in private collections, but we also have been lucky enough to get access to some very interesting artifacts and collections. The Foundation for Spiritualism and Mediumship Holland has a great potential to serve a very important goal for the future. But we cannot do this alone and we need your help also. This new project involves interviews with people who have experienced themselves trance and or physical mediums of the past. So I'm speaking about the great mediums of the past, the pioneers that paved the way. Many of us did not have the opportunity to sit with them and to experience the caliber of mediumship back then. However, some did, and some of you did. And therefore I take this responsibility to collect, to record and to share these wonderful first-hand experiences and stories. These will be shared in companionship with the Phoenix Fellowship on YouTube, but also it will be available in future in our online library. Please enjoy these wonderful memories of the past, and they will be shared with us now. Hi everyone. My name is Nicole de Haas. We have a very special guest here today, Alec Harris. He is the grandson of the famous physical medium Alec Harris from Wales. Alec was known for his many full materializations and he served the spirit world for many years. It is a privilege to have you here, Anthony, as you are one of the very few left alive to have witnessed full form materialization of the caliber of your granddad. So thank you for taking this time and opportunity.
Thanks.
So that brings me to my first question. Alec, I believe, was around the age of 35 when he discovered his mediumistic ability. So could you please expand a little on the start of his journey and how he eventually developed into a full form materialization medium?
Yes, well, my grandparents relied completely on the instruction that was given to them through spirit.
Yeah.
And the first of the main band of the circle band that made himself known was Iwonga, and Iwonga was this wonderful North American Indian. I say First Nation, don't we say that? And he said to my grandmother that he'd come to prepare the way of a very great soul who'd spent many years of our earth time lowering his vibration in order to come back to this world. And he said, the Wonga say we sit at his feet and listen to his wisdom. And then my grandmother thought, oh, this is wonderful. I wonder who this is, you see. And then one night, my grandparents were sitting in their lounge with the fireside light on, just sitting quietly, just meditating. And my grandfather said, White Wing. My grandmother thought he'd seen sort of the image of a white wing clairvoyantly. And she said, oh, darling, she said, you can see a white wing. And then he said, no, I am White Wing. And then she realized he'd gone into trance, and he stood up. And although my grandfather wasn't a tall man, he seemed much taller. And he spoke very beautifully to my grandmother. And he said that he'd come to, there was great work for them to do. And he'd come and he was going to take charge of the circle, and that the world was going to need the message that they brought. So it all started from there. So White Wing was my grandmother's principal guide. And so he was in charge of the circle. And my grandfather's principal guide was Chiang, who was Chinese. And so it all started from there. So White Wing's name for my grandmother was Faithful. He never called her Louis, he said Faithful. Oh. So she said to him once, well, White Wing, why do you call me Faithful? He said, because, and he quoted the name of the song, Old Faithful, the words. He said, when the roundup days are over, in other words, he said, when your earthly life is done, there'll be fields white with clover. When you come back to the world of spirit, you will reap the reward of all the good that you have done. Oh, faithful child of mine. He said, I've called you faithful because you always have been faithful to White Wing. And Gran didn't understand what he meant by that. And she said to him once, White Wing, how long have you known me? And he said, from the beginning. And she was a professional violinist. And one evening when she was playing in the orchestra, she looked up into the auditorium, and the whole auditorium in the middle of the concert transformed into this vision of an Indian encampment. And she could see the mist. It was early in the morning. She could see the mist on the ground and the teepees and the smoke coming out of the top of the teepees. Yeah. And she saw White Wing, and she saw herself as an Indian squaw with him. And then she realized, because she sort of, the idea of reincarnation wasn't much within her sphere of understanding at that time. And she realized that she'd obviously been with him in the past. So he was her principal guru, and in Tibetan terms, he was her root guru, I think. He was, the special connection. So he was this very deep connection they'd had. So he gave all the instruction, and the scientists had made themselves known. So every single bit of instruction, Gran was true to her name. She was faithful, and she carried it out to the T. And that's one of the reasons, I think, why they had such good development, because she was absolutely accurate in following all the instruction. And she never missed a session except one, when there was a flu epidemic at the time, and she missed the one. But that's the story in itself, which is very wonderful. But she just missed the one. But apart from that, every single time they sat. Yeah.
Was it once a week or more than once a week?
I think it was once a week.
Yeah.
I think it was once a week. Yeah. And I remember she said one of the first things she saw was this ball of light and this face in it. Mm. And it seemed still, And when she looked at it, it became alive and it looked at her and smiled. And that was one of the first, that's just the face.
Yeah.
And then it sort of started from there, really.
Yeah, wonderful.
But he was remarkable, my grandfather, because on one occasion, Gran told me, Chiang, who's my grandfather's principal guide, he had a son called Toi Toi, who was one of the healing guides, and Toi Toi chose to remain as a child. Although since my grandfather passed on, Toi Toi has since grown up. So he's grown up now, he's not a child anymore. But at that time, he stayed as a child, and he materialized one night with all his brothers and sisters, and there were about 12 of them.
Wow.
And my grand said they're ranging in height from the tallest to the smallest, all standing there. And she even said one of them had buck teeth. So they're all there. And they were all killed in a great flood at that time. So the whole family perished in the flood, yes. Yeah. So, yes.
Yeah. So you were speaking about your grandmother, Louie, also.
Yes.
Her guide. So
yes.
She was a medium herself, I assume?
Yes, I think maybe a lot of people don't really. I think one of the reasons was that the mediumship was on both sides of the family. My grandmother's father was mediumistic, although he never said it, but he was obviously clairaudient. Okay. And that's how Dad's having one of his funny days today. He's hearing voices again. But he was incredibly aware because when he died, he said to his wife, he said, "Tell Lou that I'll be the first to greet her from the other side." So he let on then, and he had far more understanding than he ever told anybody about. So, and then of course, my grandmother's one brother was a very gifted clairvoyant and landed up on the platforms. And then my gran herself had trance mediumship as well as clairvoyance to some extent, but definitely trance. But the guide said that they blended their mediumship, and that Gran was the conscious part. And Whitewing described it in the way he said that Alec was the engine, but that Gran was the power that made the engine work. So that's how it worked. I think a lot is to be said for my Gran, because my grandmother was, if it wasn't for her, he would have never have achieved what he did, because she was the driving force. Yeah. He was a very placid, very humble man, and he wouldn't have done it without her driving him mercilessly. Because as you very well know, it's a very difficult path, physical mediumship. Yeah. Yes. And I mean, if it was a bad circle, he suffered for it the next day. He would get so depressed because he would feel all the the sadness of those who couldn't come through. Yeah. So it wasn't easy. The only thing that he really enjoyed was the healing, because he could see the benefit of it. Yeah. So it was, but she was, she was an amazing woman. She really was. She was like a mighty atom. She was tiny, but so much energy.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, wonderful person.
Yeah, and that was one of the reasons why I wanted to ask, because I had the feeling that she must have influenced his mediumship big time. Yeah.
Well, my grandfather was a Piscean. And Pisces are notorious. They let things slide very easily. Yeah. They don't have much drive. My grandmother was a Leo, and so she had that leonine, the fire, the drive, you see, and definitely they were, clearly it was their life's work. They were meant to be together and do this work. Yeah, it was a perfect partnership.
Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah, and they were absolute lovebirds, They were so devoted to one another. It was absolutely wonderful. Yeah, yeah.
Yes, I'm sure it was. So you mentioned Chang and
yes.
As one of the spirit guides.
Yes.
Also, I think it wasn't it Christopher and Rowan coming into the spirit team at some point? Could you
yes.
share something about the spirit team and their work?
Yes, there was Rowan, who was, Grandma always called him the master of ceremonies. Mm. and he would always be the first to step out of the cabinet. And Rowan was French Arabian.
Okay.
And he had the most extraordinary presence, palpable love. It was really, really extraordinary. And he had the most incredible voice. It was like absolute velvet, this wonderful voice. And he'd always know who was anxious, and he'd always go to them first. And he'd shake everybody's hands. Mm-hmm. And he had these long sort of tapering fingers, so different from my grandfather, who had these sort of square, practical hands. And he would greet everybody in turn, and he had this calming influence. You'd feel this wonderful calm, wash over you as soon as you were, in front of him. So he was a master of ceremonies, and clearly a very extremely spiritual being indeed. And somebody once said to Rowan, "Oh, Rowan, you're so wonderful. Who were you when you were on the earth plane?" And he said, "My child, it doesn't matter who I was. It's what we are doing now that is of importance." Yes. And those answers, it is interesting. You asked earlier what was, the influence. For me, the most indelible thing about the whole experience of growing up with my grandparents, having such an influence in my life, was as what, the materialization was wonderful. Absolutely. There's no two ways about that. But the most lasting thing was not all of that. It's the presence that they brought that, just permeated you so completely. This literally out of this world feeling of this tremendous peace and this great love. And that was the most eloquent for me, the most profound thing of all.
Yeah.
And yes. So for me, that's something that connection has remained, with me, that connection to spirit.
Yeah.
That knowledge that they're there.
Yeah.
So I regard myself as incredibly blessed. So fortunate. Absolutely. And growing up as a child, it was only when I started going to school that I realized I couldn't talk about these things. It wasn't other children's experience. So I shut up very quickly. I was met with derision. I thought, oh, okay, yes. Yeah. So yes, to me it was normal. Yeah. Because the conversation was always, they'd speak about the guys like anybody else. So it was the sense of this whole thing was completely integrated into their lives. Yes. Which is wonderful, which is, I think, very important as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So how old were you when you had your first experience in the seance room?
I was a few months old.
Well, that's young. Yes.
Well, I don't remember that, but my grandmother said that I was in the cot in the corner of the room, and my maternal grandfather, Sam, who was from Lithuania, who I never met, except in the materialization circles, he materialized and he walked over to the cot and picked me up in his arms.
Wow.
He wanted to see his grandson. And my grandmother said that's something she'll never forget, that beautiful, picture of him in these beautiful robes, holding this little baby, his grandson in his arms.
Yeah. That's amazing, isn't it?
It is amazing.
Yeah.
It is amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you, or did they within the circle take pictures of materializations or keep records or something?
Gran never kept records. She had this incredible memory, and when she started writing the book, she sort of downloaded it from her brain. But she never wrote, as far as I'm aware, I don't know, she never wrote records of it. But she had this incredible recollection. And she's very precise with dates. I mean, I can't remember dates like she could. She's on this date and that time, this happened and that happened. She's incredible like that. Yes, the photographs, they never seem to somehow happen, really. No. It's a pity. It would have been good if it did.
Because, you know, with some of the pioneers, we do have pictures available. So that's why I was interested if they had ever the opportunity to do so. So, Alec, your granddad was already, I almost want to say fully developed, but I don't think you will ever be fully developed as a medium. But he was already a working physical medium before you were born. So for you it was normal, and that's what you explained. And when you went to school, you actually found out, well, it's a different world. But for you it was really normal, as it was for the whole family. So looking back on all of that, in what way did it affect your life and your journey? Because I can also imagine that you must have thought yourself, or perhaps your own father, is physical mediumship something for me? Is this my path also? Did it ever cross your mind?
Well, my father was a mediumistic as well, of course. He had trance and very much healing as well. And I know my father always was very clear. He said, I will never, ever want to be a physical medium, after seeing what my father had to put up with. No, it's something that never I kind of instinctually knew that wasn't what was meant for me. I never had any thought about that, really, funnily enough. But no, people would ask me and I say, no, that's not my way.
Exactly. You already explained a little about the effect that the spirit world had upon you. What do you think that, looking into your life now, I'm just wondering, are they still involved somehow? I mean, the old spirit team that worked with your granddad, because they were also part of your life, are they still actively involved, or how can I see this now? Because you build a relationship.
Absolutely. I'm trying to find the best way to answer this. What impressed me about the guides was they would never be labeled in any way, not even with spiritualism. And White Wing would often say, yes, but it's what you call spiritualism. So there was this incredible sense that that was one way in which they worked. And I'm sure there were other areas that they worked that we never knew about. So so it was like that. So really, I feel, yes, they're very much part of my life, even now, with what I do. And I'm still aware of their help. And I'm very aware of their presence. And if there's anything I want, confirmation on, I send a thought out, and then it comes, which I relied on very heavily with my dad. He was incredibly plugged in. But since he's passed away, I've realized that I have the same capacity. So it's been very much ongoing deepening process.
I heard you speaking about Alec's healing ability.
Yes.
If I'm correct, his spirit doctor was named Dr. Carl. Is that correct?
Yes, Dr. Carl, yes.
Oh, this is somewhere in the back of my mind.
Yes.
Could you please share one of the great moments in his healing career that he had that really touched people?
There was a little girl in what was called Rhodesia in those times that my grandmother said she had leukemia.
Yeah.
And she was healed of that. And the doctors were so incredulous, they said, oh, it must have been a wrong diagnosis. They couldn't understand. So I heard about that one. Myself, I'd had many examples of that. When I was born, I was cesarean, and I had, it's not an uncommon thing called pyloric stenosis as a baby. That's when the pyloric sphincter of the stomach goes into spasm, or it can't open properly, so the stomach doesn't empty, and then the baby just projectile vomits, which means that they can't get enough nourishment because it can't, go through the whole alimentary tract. So I had that, and it was quite bad, evidently. But a doula, who was the principal healing guide, gave me healing, and I didn't need surgery. They were going to give surgery. I didn't need that, so I was very lucky. Yeah. Yes, there was a doctor, not a doctor, a retired police colonel who was profoundly deaf. He had his hearing restored. There was a boy with terrible eczema who literally overnight he went to a materialization circle.
Yeah.
And he was wearing gloves because he had this wet eczema. And he was in the circle, and the spirit scientist stepped out of the cabinet. And the one lady said, "Sir, could you help my son?" And he said, "Of course." He said, so he beckoned the young man to come up to the front. And he came up, and he turned him round, and he stood behind him. And this healing light from the solar plexus of the spirit scientist shone right through this boy's body. And the next morning he woke up, and the eczema completely cleared up, everything dried up, and there was no more problem after that. So there was some, and there were others that needed more than one treatment. But yes, Dr. Carl was, is really wonderful. He's a very sort of direct, no nonsense person.
Yeah.
But so wonderful, so wonderful. And the doula, of course, was the. I always feel very emotional when I talk about the doula because he's just such an embodiment of love, And he was originally from North Africa and never mastered English, and he would most of the time be the main one working through my grandfather in trance. And he was just extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. He used sound. He'd make like a noise and breathing. That's the main method he'd use. But so very compassionate. Yes, I remember on one occasion somebody's little bird was sick, but it was a canary or a budgie, and they brought this little bird to a doula. And he used to call them animals. He couldn't say animals, animals. And he was holding this little bird in his hand. This is my grandfather in trance. And he said, and he was stroking it like this with such kindness, such compassion. He said, a doula thinks he's going to take this little bird with him now. And as he did this, the little bird died in his hands. Now, that sort of thing, so wonderful. So yes, there was Barry, who was cured of the most terrible epilepsy. He had almost he had so many fits, grand mal seizures in a day, and he was cured of that. And the spirit doctors said that there would be a young man would be coming to them that they already knew about. He would be brought to the circle, and it would make people sit up and realize the power of spirit. And it was the most terrible epilepsy, and he wasn't able to speak. And he had quite a few healings, and eventually he was completely cured. And the spirit scientists said they repaired the brain using ectoplasm. They rewired it, made whatever the repair that needed doing. They did it using that method. Yes.
Wow, amazing.
And of course, not only that, but there was a great emotional healing, of course, through, particularly during the war, when people would come, having lost an only son, for example, in the war, or a relative, tremendous grief. That was an enormous healing in itself.
Yeah.
That proof.
And that's what mediumship. Every facet of mediumship should be about healing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So your grandparents moved to South Africa at some point.
Yes.
But that was also, I guess, a turning point for your granddad, because he got injured as well in South Africa. Is that correct?
Yes, some years, many years later in South Africa, he was injured. Yes. Yes, he nearly died. But Spirit warned my grandparents about that. There was one night when one of the spirit scientists stepped out of the cabin. No, what happened was from out of the cabin it came this like wraith-like floaty, ghostly sort of shape, and it floated around the room, Yeah. And then it floated around, and then it went into the cabinet and disappeared, and everybody was going, "Ooh, isn't that amazing?" And then one of the spirit scientists stepped out, and Gran said he didn't often come, but he was also very sort of direct. And he looked at everybody and he said, "Yes," he said, "you saying, oh, isn't that amazing?" He said, "But I'm telling you," he said, "there are many in your world that expect us to look like that, the typical sort of Hollywood version of a ghost." He said, "And they find it difficult to believe when we are just like you." And he said, "I'm coming to tell you that the medium is in great danger. You must not sit again until we tell you." And my grandmother was so worried when she said that. And Vidi, who did the bookings, she said, "Oh, Louis, just, there's this people are coming a long way for the circle. Shall we just have this one, then we'll stop?" And Vidi was quite insistent. So gradually said, "Oh, all right, Vidi, but, just this one and then no more." And it was that one that had happened. So they did their best. But even then, he was protected by spirit. So he wasn't killed. But he did have a stroke shortly after that. And that's when all the public circles stopped. Yes. So it's, and tragically, the person who organized it was the president of the local spiritualist church. He, instigated this whole thing. So it was very, very tragic.
Very tragic, yeah.
That's human nature, It
is. But people also don't realize how dangerous it actually is to work publicly as a physical medium.
Yes.
Yeah. So I read somewhere that at some point Alec was not always in trance anymore during his sittings. Is that correct?
Yes, sometimes they would bring him out of trance partially. Very often when his sister Connie materialized, because she was his younger sister and they were very close.
Yeah.
And it was Connie that got my grandfather's attention when he was at the stage in the very early days when he didn't believe. There was a lot of rubbish. There was a lot of hooey. He was never going to get involved in all this nonsense. Yeah. And it was only Connie giving him proof that she was real and that it was true that made him really realize, there was something in this. So when Connie did materialize, the guys used to bring him out of trance so he would be able to see her there. And they'd have a sort of a conversation. So those were the those are the times when he did come out of trance to an extent, yes.
Yeah. Wonderful, wonderful.
There were times, of course, when he would, on numerous occasions, they dematerialize him, and he'd land up in the garden.
Yes, I've read that. Yes.
Yes, and my gran asked why they did that, and they said it was the way of cutting the conditions by removing him from the room. It helped to clear the conditions, and also sometimes the pull of people who couldn't come was so great, so to help him not feel it so strongly, they removed him from the area, so they took him into the garden. Yes.
Yeah. And there are also stories of people materializing outside in the moonlight.
Oh yes, yes, yes. On one occasion, my dad had a dog called Waltz, and he was like a fox terrier. He's a mongrel, but he looked like a big fox terrier. And Waltz developed a terrible like mange on his back, and it was very painful, and he wouldn't let anybody near him. He was very distressed with this. And one evening they had a materialization circle, and the spirit scientist said, he said, Louis, he said, I believe your dog is not well. And she said, oh yes. He said, we can help him. And so he said, open the door. And so they had their circle in the upper room on the first floor. And it was a full moonlight night. Even my dad was telling me, he said it's one of the things he always remembered was this beautiful scene. So they opened the door of the seance room, and the spirit scientist stepped out, and he seemed to pick up my gran's thoughts, and he said, because Wogs wouldn't let anybody near him, he'd growl because he's in such pain. And he'd always be waiting on the landing for the circle to finish, you see, and he was there. And the spirit scientist said, don't worry, Louis, we've taken care of him. So he was fast asleep, in this deep sleep, and he was lying in the moonlight, and the moonlight was coming through the window. And there was the spirit scientist in the moonlight, giving healing to the dog. And my father says he always remembers that beautiful scene of the moonlight on the roads. It was this sort of luminous white. It was the most beautiful thing. He often said, I always remember that, of the dog, of the guide giving healing to the dog. And the next morning, it all dried up, and so that sort of healed the dog from that. But yes, that happened, yes.
Yeah, yes. Wonderful, wonderful. As we both know, and this is my final question, as we both know, physical mediumship is rare, and especially materialization mediumship. And when we look back in history, we had some physical mediums of the caliber like your granddad, but not that many. What is your view on the future for physical mediumship? Have you ever thought about it?
Yes, I have.
Have you ever thought in the spirit world about it?
Yeah, I think we're living in interesting times, and it's something I've been feeling, and I think there's something around this that spirit are concerned about, or need to get something happening. And the world of today is very different to the world of my grandparents. And one of the most important things White Wing said, and I think it's true today as it was in those days, he said that the phenomena of spiritualism is to attract people's attention. It is like the doorway.
Yeah.
And he said, it's to get people's attention, he said. But he said that doorway leads through to the banqueting hall of the Great Spirit. He said too many stand at the door and they do not enter the banqueting hall to partake of the wisdom that the Great Spirit has to offer. In other words, to get the teaching.
Yeah.
And I think spiritualism, I think this is true for humanity when it comes to anything of a spiritual nature, but I think spiritualism by its nature is more vulnerable in that I think as people looking into this, we need to ask ourselves questions sometimes and to ask, what is our motivation? Mm-hmm. Is it an indulgence or some form of entertainment? You know, we can get very swept up in the phenomena. And then when that we engage that, what happens is that the habitual part of the mind, which is the materialistic side, kind of messes it up, and instead of being something really meaningful, it becomes reduced into a form of entertainment. Yep. And this is very sad, and this will happen in all walks of spirituality, this similar process. And it's something I'm particularly interested in, you know, when looking from the meditation side as well. And so I think this is very important. And so I think this has happened a lot in spiritualism, is that people stay with the phenomena, but actually themselves are none the wiser in the sense of who am I? Yeah. What is my real nature? You know, and so this is a great shame, and I think White Wing was very true when he said that, you know, and I think so. The questions, you know, it could be a situation of just when I thought I had all of life's answers, somebody changed the questions. The world is changing, and I think for the future we need to ask questions, and I think spiritualism needs to take its place in the world and have dialogue. And what you and Nicole are doing, I think, is very important, because you're starting to have dialogue with the wider community. And I think it has to happen, because I think the nature of the universe is relationship. The nature of the universe is interdependence. Everything exists in an interdependent way, and the way things have their fullest meaning is only in relationship to other things. So spiritualism will come to its full potential when it starts interfacing with other things, when there's a meaningful dialogue, because everything learns from everything else. And I know it's had a bad press from, you know, mediums being treated very badly by scientists in the past, but that is the past. We cannot afford to let that continue, to keep spiritualism just in the seance room. It needs to also communicate not just with the next world, but with this world. And that's not happening enough. And I think it needs to. When I see, if I were to look at, for example, the area of mindfulness, which is now huge in our world, in the sort of secular teaching of meditation, mindfulness has been in its present form in the West for about 40 years at the very most. And the amount of how it's informed neuroscience, psychology, environmental, in so many ways, it's had such a huge impact because it's communicated. And I'm thinking spiritualism has been around for over 100 years, and this hasn't happened yet, but it's going to. Absolutely, it has to.
Yes.
You know, and so this has been a great source of frustration for me over the years because of my deep understanding of it. And I realized I was so blessed because I had the very best of it, you know, with my grandfather. And I know it's it has something so important to contribute to the bigger picture, and this has to happen. You know, it has to happen, and it'll be wonderful when it does. It really, really will be wonderful. Yeah. I'm off my soapbox now.
Well, thank you for sharing your thoughts on this. Yes, yes, I agree. And also what you were saying, you mentioned the mindfulness part, and that's the area where you work in, and that you teach, if I'm correct.
Yes.
And I think one of the most important things that we often forget within our mediumship development is the personal development. And also in physical mediumship, it's, you know, I personally believe that it's all about personal and spiritual development, not about the development of the medium itself, because it's already there. It's the personal development that brings the success eventually. That's what I believe.
Yes. Yeah. It has to. Whitewing, another important thing Whitewing said about mediumship, he said you cannot pour water through a dirty vessel and expect it to come out clean.
Yeah, exactly.
He also said we can't choose our instruments. We've got to work with what we've got. And I think spirit can only do so much. The rest is up to us.
Yes, exactly.
So there are things that is the medium's responsibility to ensure that they are as clean a vessel, as pure a vessel as possible, so that there's the least amount of colouring from their own process within it. Yes, absolutely.
Exactly. Okay. So I'm going to end this interview, and I want to thank you, Anthony, very much for your time and you know, everything that you shared with us.
Yes.
So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Nicole.